Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the South Dakota Forest Health Workshop Series. This June episode is our What Did We See This Spring episode. As we are looking down the barrel of the end of spring, we're looking at some hotter temperatures at the end of this week. Dr. Ball feels it's a good time to go over what we saw this spring, the effects of the weather, different various pests in our region, and then what we might look forward to in the summer and the fall. So thank you for being here. This workshop is being recorded. We will put the recording on our YouTube playlist for later viewing. Should you want to show this to any of your colleagues or come back for information in the future, this workshop is qualified for SAF and ISA certified uh, CEUs, continued education units. If you are an SAF forester, please put your SAF credentials in the chat box during this workshop. And I know last month we changed it up with the ISA credentials. It seemed to work just fine. If you had any issues or if you have not had them approved in your ISA um, account, please let me know. However, shortly after sending that email, I received an email from ISA saying that they are changing their credentialing system and that post approval will only be for yourself. And so I can no longer, starting next month, I can no longer put in your credentials for you on a post approval form. So we're going to go back to the old standard that we've been doing. Any ISA certified arborists will be reporting for themselves at the end of this workshop. Dr. Ball will have a code for you and the title. So we're going back to the old way. And if anything changes, I'll be sure to let you know. But again, thanks for joining us. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat box. We should have some time at the end of our discussion to go over those questions. And without further ado, Dr. Ball, the floor is yours.
All right. Well, thank you very much. And let me get this up. All right. There we go. This up. All right. Well, thanks for joining us, everyone. And thank you again, Tony, for moderating this session. We've got a lot of news to talk about today. I'm saving some towards the end. That's a teaser. But, what are we seeing this spring is really kind of the focus today. And also, as Tony mentioned, what we're seeing going forward. But let's start out with the news that isn't news, and that's the Asian needle ant. Now, I don't know how many have been watching the news this last week, but there's been a huge outpouring of stories. ABC, NBC, CBS, Fox, you name it, have been talking about this ant. Now, by the way, this ant has been in the United States since the 1930s, so it's not brand new, but it has been a little more common in the Southeast, and it is an ant that some people can go under anaphylactic shock if they're stung, bitten by this ant. And as the media often does, they kind of gravitate towards something and it's big news all of a sudden, and then it goes back to normal. Again, I'm not dismissing the concern. It is a forest dwelling ant. And for those folks in Georgia and such that may be out gardening, they could end up getting stung by this ant. And again, there have been people who have had this become a very serious medical emergency. So it is kind of important. But the important thing is it's not here. And why do I say that? Because the maps they were showing show South Dakota. Now, some of you might notice it's kind of out by itself. Now, there's that outlier that is Wisconsin, but that one is easily explainable. But if you look everywhere else, it's why South Dakota? And apparently there was some report from someone somewhere, something that it may have been there. By the way, for all you North Dakotans that may be watching this was actually picked up by some North Dakota radio stations even. And they broadcast it or talked about it without providing any state information. So I wouldn't be surprised there's some North Dakotans thinking, whoa, boy, the radio station was talking about this last week. Even put a little blurb up. Didn't say where it is, but if they're talking about it in North Dakota, maybe it's in North Dakota. And so clearly, people, it's not here. It's not in North Dakota. Um, but again, this is one of those things that suddenly popped up. We had the media contacting all the entomologists in the state here and asking us, hey, could we do interviews? Could we talk about it and all that? And the problem is there was no there. And so if you heard the reports that we have a new pest, at least at this point, we do not. So it's not a real panic moment. And by the way, when and if it does arrive, it's just going to be one of many introduced pests that, again, a little different than our common ant. You don't want to invite them to your picnic. But again, it has been in this country since the 1930s, so it's not new really anywhere. All right, so let's get on to what has happened. This last spring, I did predictions of 2025, and part of them are, of course, coming true, and it's not like I have that good of sense of what's occurring, but just we all knew we were in a drought last year. And so a lot of what we're seeing right now is based on the drought conditions that were occurring last year. And this last spring, I showed this picture. This is what I call my rain gauge. It's at the exit 132, 133, I forget the exact one, for interior along I-90. And in this pond, there is a wall drug sign. And I've always used how high the water is up on the sign as kind of a measure how wet it is. The sign is not even near the water. And if you look this summer, you can see it's just as bad. We have been getting rains throughout much of the state except the southeast. They're still a little behind. But if you take a look at our subsoil moisture, we're still kind of behind it. So a lot of what we're looking at is really due to, in part, to the dry fall and dry winter that we had. We take a look here. Here's March 5th for South Dakota. You can take a look at all the state was under some type of drought intensity. You'll notice that we didn't even have one that hit abnormally dry. They were drought conditions from moderately drought to extreme drought. Now, as I'll talk about, that has been changing, and we all appreciate it. But our subsoil moisture is still kind of behind everywhere, and trees tend to dip into that for summer. So let's hope the rains continue a little bit longer at the very least. But because of the dry conditions, we saw a tremendous amount of winter desiccation injury. For example, on the spruce. And here's the way you get the calls. It suddenly turned color. And the call started in April. They certainly increased in May during that week. The temperatures hit 90. But you know what's interesting? For people that had their cut Christmas trees that they stuck out in the rest of the winter for a bird feeder, guess what? A lot of those started turning color about that time too. And they didn't have any roots. They already were dry. And so the damage occurred in the wintertime, but it wasn't noticeable until things started trying to green up in the spring. And I had to explain to a lot of people because people were looking at, well, what did somebody spray? Well, nobody had to spray anything. We had a lot of discolored conifers that, again, winter desiccation injury. They went into the fall dry and they went into winter dry. And so any winter winds, and we had a relatively warm winter, those needles were almost the consistency of a Pringles potato chip. And so were easily affected by the conditions. This is classic. This is off a Scots pine, and no, this is not pine wilt disease. And it just illustrates what I could show on a lot of spruce trees and on a lot of other pine species, is that if you take a look, the tip of the needle. And by the way, it was almost uniform. Sometimes only on the south side of the tree, sometimes on the side that was exposed to the most winds, sometimes completely around the trees. But if you looked, it was the tips of the needles that were scorched, and you could almost draw a line, as I did here, that the bases were green, the tips were scorched. And this is classic, what we call winter burn, desiccation injury. It occurred on a lot of trees as well. Now, the ones that were most commonly affected were maples, birch, and honey locust. Those three trees, okay, the maples, the birch, the honey locust, do not tolerate winter dryness very well at all. When I used to work in nurseries and we put bare root stock into coolers for the winter, the trees you couldn't keep as long in the cooler as the others, the ones that had the shortest shelf life, were these. Okay, the maples, the birch, and the honey locust. And so they went into the fall dry, so they didn't have a lot of moisture. They could not prepare for winter sufficiently. And then with the dry winter winds, what happened is a lot of desiccation. So we had a lot of tip dieback on these trees. You can still see it out there. This is actually notice it seems a little yellow. This is one of the yellow cultivars, the sunburst honey locust. But a lot of tip dieback in these. Now, the interesting thing is I have not seen a northern acclaim honey locust with any of these. And I might add, we get this a number of times over the last 10 years. And that is one cultivar, northern acclaim, which was released from North Dakota, that has really stood up to our harsh winters. Now, there's others that are being released recently too, and we're trying to look at those as well. But if you have some of the old standbys, the Imperials, for example, the Moraines, Shade Masters, those have been out for a long time and they're really marginalized in South Dakota. And if we get any dry winters like this, we expect to see dieback. And we did in a lot of those cultivars. But as I said, the cultivar release from North Dakota, Northern Acclaim, has really held up well for us. Now, a lot of recently planted spruce, and by that, within the last 2 years, when we were under some level of drought intensity, they're all suffering. And this one, you can see the growth on it the last couple of years has been very, very little, and the needles are very short. And this tree is about 6 feet tall, and it's covered with cones from last year. And a lot of people say, well, the tree seems to be fine. It's got cones on it. No, cones are a symptom of stress in small trees. When you're 6 feet tall, you shouldn't be producing cones. But if you're stressed, you will. And that's even going to take more energy away from you. So it's not a good thing to have them produce cones. And on a small tree, a young tree, it is not a symptom of health. It's a symptom of decline. And the problem with these trees, they were not watered last year. Now, at all? No, they were watered, but was more like you're going to tease them with a little water now and then. Well, I'd set the sprinkler every now and then around them. Well, what did that come out to be? Maybe twice and not a lot of water. And of course, with the dry conditions we had last summer and fall, that was not adequate. And again, these trees are not doing well at all. What's interesting though is everybody's had a lot of moisture this spring. And I've been getting some pictures like this, where spruce that have died back are producing all these epicormic shoots and are expanding. Now look at this one. Everything has died along the lower branches, but it's sprouting back. I doubt if it's going to sprout back enough that you're going to get a full tree again. But with the rains we're getting, some trees are taking advantage of that, and from buds that are released when conditions are favorable, we're actually getting some green growth on spruce along the trunks. Well, what else did we have for weather? It was region wide. The range of the fluctuation differs. But if you remember early May, it was hot, very hot. And what I'm showing you here is from Sioux Falls, South Dakota, so you kind of have an idea. Back there, May 9th, 10th, and that, temperatures in the 90s. And a lot of trees were trying to break bud then. And then about a week and a half later, look at how the temperatures dropped. We had temperatures in the mid 30s at that time. And of course, in some areas, we ended up actually with frosts. It was cold enough. Well, that rapid temperature change from very hot to fairly cool caused a lot of problems as well. What was interesting, some trees that were leafing out, that kind of stalled them when the temperatures cooled. And what we get is a few more anthocyanins being produced, the red pigments, and the leaves were turning kind of a red color to them. So we were getting these reds and such appearing along it. Now, the interesting thing, and maples were doing this as well, but one that was interesting, and it varied with the tree, but all the calls I got from people saying the seeds coming down from our silver maple are pink or red, and they don't often see that. And this will occur when we have, again, temperatures that go cool very quickly, combined with the drought the previous year, conditions we certainly saw. So you might have saw it was kind of attractive, but nevertheless, it was kind of interesting that we saw these. And the elms, the seed crop was incredible. And again, the seed crop was based upon the conditions the previous year, the dry conditions. And look at this elm. And by the way, note the snow in the background. Um, that here we are out in the hills, Black Hills of South Dakota, and the trees were producing so much seed, it almost looked like leaves. Well, if you look at those same trees now, they look very thin and tufted. Why? Everywhere along the shoot where there were flowers and then seeds, no leaves developed. And so a lot of the plants have these gaps where you had flowers and then seeds, and then the leaves were produced and the leaves are at the tip. And if you go through Rapid City, which is one where we saw it the most, Rapid City spearfishing down to Hot Springs and that, you look at a lot of elms, particularly the Siberian elms, which a lot of people call Chinese elms, and that they look horrible, worse than they normally do. And they look very thin and just tufts of foliage at the tips. Well, everything behind those tufts of spring was loaded with seeds. And we're seeing the same thing in silver maples. Some of the silver maples are just down to tufts, and that's about it. And so, again, is it a real harm? No, but that's why they look thin. Well, what else happened? Well, as I say, we kind of got an early start to the spring there. It warmed up and then got extremely hot, and then it snowed. I took this picture down in Custer State Park on May 19th. And I've seen this before, and a lot of folks from that area certainly have as well. It's not too surprising, but it is kind of funny going from just a t-shirt to your winter coat again. Temperatures really dropped. We got quite a bit of snow for a couple of days, and then it kind of quickly melted. We could go inside, we could put warmer clothes on, but everything that was trying to break bud at that time. Now, by the way, this was region wide. Now, we didn't see the snow in eastern South Dakota, for example, but the temperatures got very cold. And if you were a tree that was early in leafing out. For example, our basswoods, our lindens. Your leaves came through this just fine. Why? They had fully matured and they were fairly thick and tough. If you're a tree that leaves out late, like our bur oaks, well, you hadn't broke bud yet and you're okay. But if you're caught in the middle, which is where hackberry was, and always is when we get those temperature changes, you just had leaves, buds just starting to open. And we saw a tremendous amount of damage to those. And maples were often caught by this as well. We don't plant a lot of them, but shagbark hickories were hit. I got call after call with trees, typically the maples, the hackberries, which are very commonly planted. Didn't get much calls on shagbark hickory, of course, but the calls were, you need to come out and test the leaves on my tree. Why? They're all turning black. All of a sudden, somebody must have sprayed. Not necessarily. This was region wide. And of course, it occurred all of a sudden because here you had these buds that were starting to pop when you got temperatures in the 90s and then the temperatures dropped and we ended up with damage. Maples, look at this. It was just leafing out and we got a real cold snap in this community and all the leaves that were opening just shriveled and died. I got this picture and it's great. This is a sugar maple. And this sugar maple picture was taken the previous fall. So that's the way the tree looked last fall. This is what it looked like this spring. And you'll notice a lot of the other trees in the background there are already leafed out. If you got close to this tree, you would see that it's producing new buds. And those buds are starting to open. And I didn't have time to get another picture of this tree. I apologize for that. But it's leafing out just fine now. Okay, so all the homeowner had to do, which is what they did, is water a little bit. Their area of the state, South Dakota, down in Lincoln, Minnehaha County, is still a little behind in moisture, so watering was beneficial. And the trees are producing new buds and they're leafing out. But hackberries, and I had this picture sent to me from one of our state parks, and they said, our hackberries were starting to leaf out, and then they dropped everything. That was very common. What we call it is hackberry tatters because it seems to be a tree that's often caught by these rapid temperature changes. And the leaves will have all these holes in them. It's like, what's been eating the leaves here? Now, we do have insects that'll cause some similar damage, June bugs, for example. But we can get this just from rapid temperature changes. And it's kind of unusual, and you get all this discoloration and browning on them. But the best way to describe it is think of as the leaves just coming out, some of the cells are damaged. So that's my little dot on this balloon. Think of taking a little balloon and putting a dot on it, and then blowing the balloon up. That dot gets bigger, doesn't it? Same thing with the leaf coming out. Okay, you had some damage in some of the cells. Well, it's pretty small when that leaf is just starting. But when that leaf fully expands, now you have all these holes in it. It's not a great analogy. There's a lot of differences between balloons and leaves, but I think it illustrates the point that these leaves with the holes in them, that hole didn't suddenly show up. As the leaf got bigger, it also got bigger, but it was always there because of the damage. But you go through a lot of communities, and here's what your hackberries look like right now. That they leafed out or started to leaf out, and then look at the street covered in hackberry leaves. Now, we've seen this before. And I'm going to show you a picture from one of the previous years. We had this happen in the 2010s, for example. And there's the new hackberry leaves by July 20th. I've seen them starting to leaf out again about 4th of July. And if our temperatures stay relatively cool, which they're not this weekend, of course, we're going to see temperatures perhaps in the 3 digits. But if we have just kind of the weather we've had so far, kind of warm but not hot, and adequate moisture, those new buds will open just fine and everything will leaf out. And by the end of July, you can't even tell the hackberry had any damage. Now, on the other hand, if it goes to very hot and windy, the new buds will desiccate as well. And we may see some dieback or possibly even have some hackberries die. But in previous years, they generally come back. And by the end of July, they look absolutely fine. You can't even tell they've been damaged. This happens to them, a couple of times every decade, maybe not the same tree, but it's something we've seen before and we're going to see again. Well, what's changed? Well, for South Dakota and to a degree North Dakota as well, we have actually every other areas of the state now that are not under drought whatsoever. And most of the state has at least dipped to abnormally dry. Why? Because we've been getting rains, and the Black Hills has certainly been getting rain over the last month or so. But we're getting mushrooms popping up, and people have been sending me pictures. Typically, they ask me, "Can I eat this?" Now, I'm never going to give advice on what mushrooms to eat based on a picture and an email. I still recommend everybody go out with an experienced mushroom hunter if you're going to pick these to eat. But, I tell people, well, these are called stinkhorns. You'll notice the flies are gathered on them. And if you break them, they'll smell. And people say, oh, yeah, you're right. I said, yeah, just leave them alone. There's just a lot of organic matter in the soil, like an old stump or something. Inky caps, another mushroom, will do the same thing. But our wet weather, these are popping up earlier than I typically see. And what are we seeing right now as well? Apple scab. Oh my goodness. Many years I don't see the symptoms really appearing until the end of June. This time they've been appearing at the beginning of June. That there's a lot of very susceptible crab apples that are already dropping leaves. And the leaves that are held on them have all these blotches to them. The disease, the spores are released from the old fallen leaves, so everything that was on the ground. And if you have cool, moist conditions, which is a perfect description of the weather we've had since the middle of May. Okay, it's been cool, mild, I should say, and it's been wet. So those spores, when they land on these leaves, germinate, and now the fungus is inside the plant. So it's too late to spray. This is something you start spraying as the buds are expanding. So when people call me now and say, what can I do? Nothing really. Rake. And that's about it. Now, by the way, if you came onto campus right outside my building are some wonderful crab apples. What we have is the red jewel crab apple. Every leaf is perfect. They're very resistant to apple scab. But there are as many other cultivars, Hopa, for example, which are almost completely defoliated. Spring snow is another one that I've looked at trees now. Half the leaves are on the ground. They're that susceptible to apple scab and apple scab is bad this year because we've had a moist, relatively cool spring. We're also going to see a lot of cedar apple rust. Okay, a few weeks ago, we are getting all these nice apples, if you will, if you want to call them that, on the cedars and the little telea horns forming, and they were releasing the spores to go to the apples and crab apples. And again, the conditions were perfect. It was relatively cool and moist, perfect for germinating the fungus and having them penetrate the leaves. And so this is a picture I took in previous years, note August. But I really expect in the next couple of weeks, people that have apples or crab apples that are susceptible to apples, to cedar apple rust, are going to be sending me pictures and giving me calls and saying what's occurring on my tree. And in this case, you notice all this fuzz on the bottom from the fruiting structures, and that'll help separate it from apple scab. These are popping up. This is a picture that was sent to me yesterday from Murdo. But I've taken pictures of this all the way down to Dakota Dunes and all the way out to Rapid City. It seems to be more common this year, again, because of the moist, cool conditions. It's been perfect year for rust disease to develop. And once again, you look at the underside of the leaves, you can see all those little fruiting structures to it. All rust diseases have an alternate host. This is cord grasses, grasses found in marshes. And those spores can travel a long way. And of course, the foliage on ash this year was moist, and there was just enough moisture long enough. We measure it in terms of hours that the spores could germinate, penetrate the leaves, and obviously infect the plant. I expect to get a lot more pictures of this in the next couple of weeks. And people say, what can I do? Nothing. You would have actually had to apply the fungicide early this spring when the buds were breaking. And we rarely see heavy infections on ash. And so nobody sprays every year just in case. Now, for apples, for the apple scab, if you have susceptible cultivar, you spray every year just in case, because most years you'll see an infection. But this year we're going to see a lot of ash rust, and again, many years we don't see any or very little. And we're also seeing cereal rust on common buckthorn. Most people say, "Well, who cares? It's a weed," and I get it. But the cultivars, fine line glossy buckthorn. Here's another picture I got this week. So this is going to be a rusty year. Okay, cool, moist conditions allowed all their spores to germinate on the leaves and infect the host plant. And so we're getting all this discoloration. We're getting all these galls forming. And I expect to see this over the next couple of weeks as well. And it is too late for any treatment this year. And add this Buckeye rust. You can see the discolorations on the top, on the underside. Once again, you see the little fuzz of the fruiting structures. And I might add, if you're planting autumn splendor Buckeye as just an example, I rarely, if ever, see any rust disease on this cultivar. Now, on the species, somebody plants an Ohio Buckeye or a squirrel planted it for you. That's where I see the disease. But on the cultivars, they tend to be relatively disease free. So this is another good shout out for planting improved cultivars rather than just planting the species as one of your ornamental trees. And this is popping up, plum pockets. This last couple of days, I've been getting a lot of pictures of these. People are noticing that the fruit on their plum trees, particularly their wild plums and such, that they notice that the plum is now this big kind of distorted, and you can squeeze it, and if you poke your finger into it, it's hollow. It's called plum pockets. Now, many of our plum cultivars have a fair amount of resistance to this. So it's one you're more likely to see on our ornamental plums that we have, or the wild plums you can. But I sometimes see this on the ones people have planted to harvest the fruit, and there's nothing to harvest here. But again, we had really moist conditions this spring across our state, South Dakota. And so we're seeing a lot of these leaf and fruit diseases occurring fairly early on. It's also looking like a good year for scales. Scales as adults are sessile. They look like little bumps on the plant. But they're young, which we call crawlers, are microscopic. And they walk around the plant. Quite often they go from the shoot out to the leaves. And then later in the season, they go from the leaves back to the shoot to become adults, which are sessile. They just stay in one spot. But they're sucking sap out of the plant. Now, we have scales that we call our armored scales, such as oyster shell scale. It does not produce honeydew. But we have a lot, such as European elm scale, and it's been a bad year for these, that they produce honeydew. And here's an infected tree. You know, one way you can tell the leaves are thin, this canopy is very open, the leaves are yellow, and the bark is black. Why? all that honeydew dripping down from the insects, they secrete the honeydew as they feed, really becomes infected with a sooty mold. And so you get this black powdery appearance on the plant. That's how thick they are this year. Oh my goodness. Now, these are adult scales from last year. About 2 weeks ago, the eggs that were laid underneath these shells hatched, and now we have the microscopic crawlers moving out and feeding. They still can be treated, but without treatment, you'll notice is that all the leaves are sticky. Anything underneath that tree will be sticky. And a lot of surfaces underneath that tree not only be sticky, but they'll be covered with a black soot. And that's the sooty mold. So sucking insects, perfect year, cool and moist. And we're getting a lot of aphid problems. This is ash leaf curl aphid. If you peel this back, what you'll find are the aphids, and they're crawling underneath her. They're a hard thing to treat. Why? Because any spray you apply to the foliage is not going to penetrate that foliage and kill the aphids by contact. What you need is something that enters the leaf, so as these aphids are sucking the sap, they're going to be killed, or use a systemic treatment in the ground. However, you're too late for the ground. Most of our soil applied insecticides, whether it be injections in the trunks or soil drenches around, can take several weeks to get up through the canopy. It's not immediate, at least with enough that will kill. So in a lot of cases, you may be a little late this year, but there are some sprays you can use if you need to knock this down. Now, one point I want to make, nothing's going to uncurl these. So really any spraying you're doing at this point is more revenge spraying. You ruined my plant, I'm going to kill you, as opposed to being effective treatment. Well, what about borers? I'm not really discussing it today because it only affects the Black Hills for the most part. But normally what we tell people is if you're thinning your pine trees, something we always recommend, and you're laying down slash, that's all the tops and branches, or the small trees, you're just cutting those up and piling them too as you thin. You want to get that done by January. Why? Because we want that to dry out so it is not inviting to the beetles that start looking for some green material to infest the spring. Well, unfortunately, a lot of people didn't do that. They were laying down slash even into April and May. The concern we have there is the beetles will go in there, they'll have enough time to raise their young. When their young hatch, because it's dry, they won't be able to attack the slash. It's dried out now. They'll go and attack the surrounding trees. Generally speaking, if your April, May, June rainfall is less than 75% average, okay, take the average rainfall, April, May, and June. If it's less than 75% of that, that's when we see the pines vulnerable to attack by the pine engraver beetles, the little cousins to mountain pine beetle. This year, they've had abundant moisture. I've talked with Kurt Allen, my counterpart with the U.S. Forest Service. We're of the same opinion. If these rains keep up, even if you put down slash late, which we do not recommend, you're probably going to get lucky that when those new adults come out of the slash in about another 2 or 3 weeks, the trees are too healthy and the beetles won't have any success in attacking them, and the beetles will have to just live in whatever small green fallen branches they find. But again, we normally don't recommend doing it in the spring, cutting in the spring and piling it just because it is an attractant. And by the way, it is an attractant. Those piles are loaded with beetles right now. In fact, our survey yesterday, which we were completing down in Custer, showed that the galleries are all the egg galleries are all finished. The eggs are being laid along those galleries, and we're seeing a couple of larvae starting to hatch from eggs. So in about another 2, 3 weeks, we ought to see adults coming out of those. And again, with as wet as it is, they're probably not going to be able to attack the standing trees, and that's a good thing. Well, what about other borers out there? Well, let's start with bronze birch borer. As a reminder, bronze birch borer is native to South Dakota, North Dakota, Minnesota. And the only time it has success on our native birch trees, if those birch trees are stressed. Now, you're stressed just being in South Dakota because of the hot, dry conditions, and that can leave you vulnerable to attack. But if you're planting one of our native species, and one of my favorites, quite honestly, is the Renaissance Reflection. Why? That's a very heat tolerant paper birch, and our birch don't like our high temperatures. In fact, what this tree would prefer to have is mulch around the base to keep the root zone cooler. But these trees, as long as they're healthy and not stressed, are not going to be attacked by our bronze birch borer. But the Asian and European birch, they will be attacked. Why? They don't have the defenses to protect themselves from our bronze birch borer. So the cutleaf European birch, the only place I see them get this big in South Dakota is in communities so far separated from any other birch. Bronze birch borer is not in the town. So we got some huge European birch in some little tiny communities. They're the only birch in the town. Well, there's no bronze birch borer, so they actually get some size. And it brings up the point, if there's no evolutionary history, there's little relationship between stress and resistance. In other words, it doesn't matter how healthy you have for or watering, nutrients, and that you do for your European birch, it is going to be susceptible regardless. And that's true with the Asian birch. Now, North Dakota released a Dakota Pinnacle birch, and it's a beautiful birch, but it's an Asian birch. And why some thought early on that it would be resistant, and for some reason, I've seen this since the 70s. Every new cultivar of an Asian birch, they say, it'll be resistant to bronze birch borer. They're not. They have no evolutionary history. When we plant any of these trees, they usually die within about 5 or 6 years because they've been attacked by the bronze birch borer. Now, not always. And again, they're nice trees and you can treat them, but you have to treat them to protect them from the borer. Here's a good example. These are 3 that were planted, and I got called out because, well, why were the trees dying at the tops? I mean, and when I looked at them, those, and for example, the Crimson Frost, which is a cross between the Asian and the European. Here's a picture of one I took in Rapid City a week ago. Well, why is it dying back? Well, if you look, they all were attacked by bronze birch borer. And bronze birch borer is a close relative to emerald ash borer. But in this case, on birch, you can always see the galleries. It's kind of like something underneath a blanket. Okay, do you see how bumpy it is there? That's the gallery for the bronze birch borer. You don't see that on ash with the emerald ash borer, but birch bark's kind of like a thick blanket. And you'll actually see the tunnels coming underneath it that are created by the bronze birch borer larvae. All right, we're going to finish up with ash. Well, a couple of things. It's still marching around our 2 states, and we'll talk about that in a moment. As everybody's aware of, this is a fatal insect for our ash. They will be killed if they are not being treated. I still get people saying, well, maybe mine won't. Well, that'll be the first. Now, there have been some ash out east that somehow have survived. Some of it is merely luck. Some of it may be genetic, but it's very, very, very rare. In a lot of streets like this that were lined with ash, the same street now has no trees because all the ash are gone. And if you go into areas such as Minnehaha County, where we found it in 2018, it has now infested all the shelter belts in that county. And any of the small wooded areas where we have ash as a riparian species that are laying on the ground. Well, here's the current map of the infested areas. Okay, ones that we know of. We can tell you where it confirmed it. That doesn't necessarily mean that's where it is. Nobody ever finds the first infested tree. It's found up in Winnipeg. It's found over in the Moorhead area. There is, as far as I'm aware, only one find still in North Dakota. And then we have several in South Dakota. And by the way, there's been a couple of new ones in Kansas this last week as well. But the one I want to mention, and the news release went out this morning, we have two new counties in South Dakota. Now, it was about a week and a half ago, we confirmed it in Milbank. And by we confirmed it, a homeowner had trees that they thought, well, these look like what they say is emerald ash borer. Our local forester came out, looked at it, and said, well, I'm pretty sure it is. He called me so I could come up there and confirm it. And what I have to do is find a life stage, an adult, a larvae, something that we can identify. I can't do a new county just because I find some galleries. But I was able to collect some adults, and we were able to say that Milbank has an infestation. And so Grant County is now under quarantine. And then last week, the city forester of Watertown contacted me and sent me some pictures, said, John, what do you think? And I drove up there and sure enough was able to collect some adults in that because the adults are coming out now. And so as of this morning, that now we have Watertown confirmed as an infestation, and that means Cottington County is now under quarantine. So those two within 2 weeks of each other, and it's not going to surprise me that we may find a few more yet this year. And so keep your eyes out for this in South Dakota and in North Dakota, frankly. But I want to show you the Milbank ones. Look at this picture and look at this picture. What's important about this picture is these trees have been infested for about 4 years, and we can determine that by taking a cross section of a tree, obviously destructive sampling, and look at where the galleries are appearing and what growth rings. But when you find a tree that's blonded all the way to the base, that it may be standing dead or near dead, you're finding D-shaped holes at about your height. You're looking at a tree that's been infested for 4 years, possibly 5. And so the important thing here is it's been there a while. It isn't like we found it this year and the trees were only infested last year. In fact, quite honestly, the first year a tree's infested, you can't really tell. I know people say, well, I'm going to look for those D-shaped holes. The first few years, those D-shaped holes are up in the canopy. When you're looking at D-shaped holes right here, that's a zombie tree. It's either dead or fairly near death. So, when you pulled the bark back on these trees, and again, a number of them were just flat out dead, you can see all these galleries, again, at about 4 feet above the ground, as well as D-shaped holes, numerous D-shaped holes. And so our find there, it's been there for a while. So now the question is, how far has it spread from that area? The adults are flying right now, by the way, and there is one of them. They do feed on the leaves of ash. Mom has to feed on the leaves for about a week or so before she starts laying eggs. And by the way, she kind of nibbles on leaves between laying eggs, or they must be kind of like a pickle. All right, something during pregnancy. because she will not lay eggs unless she's kind of gone out and eaten more leaves. So she nibbles on leaves throughout her lifetime in between bouts of egg laying. And there's the eggs. They're impossible to see. She actually will put them under bark flakes and that rough bark. They love to lay eggs underneath. And that we're gonna see those now during June, early July. Those eggs will hatch soon, and we'll start finding the very small larvae. And I expect to start seeing those in about another week, probably down in Dakota Dunes country, where we had our first emergence. I think that was mid-May, a little early this year. And of course, the larvae gradually get larger and larger and larger. They overwinter, and then in the spring, they form that pupal stage, and they almost look like the adult, don't they? And then they start coming out of that and emerge. Might add too that right now we have this one county, a rest area, where they were able to find emerald ash borer. And I believe that was detected originally from adults that were stuck onto one of those purple panel traps. And then when they went and investigated, found the infestation there. So it's in both states, and it's probably in more areas than what we know. So what does that mean? Well, you've got such as Watertown. These are all appear to be healthy ash. Perhaps they are, but they won't be within a few years. And the city is doing like many cities are doing. They're actively thinning out their ash, taking them down, preemptive attack, if you will. They've taken down about 800 trees already, and by that I mean last year and so on. They've got about another 6,500 to go of publicly owned ash trees, and usually we get kind of a 2-to-1. In other words, if a community has one ash tree publicly owned, there's probably two privately owned ash trees. So you look at it, there's probably about 18,000 ash trees to 20,000 ash trees in Watertown, South Dakota that are either going to be removed or need to be treated, because if they're not treated, they're going to die. So you might as well cut them down sooner rather than later. But treatments are effective, and we certainly appreciate people treating their trees because we don't want to see ash disappear from the ornamental landscape. And if you have a large ash, by that 20 inches in diameter or more, that's a healthy ash, it makes a lot of sense to have it professionally treated so that you can maintain the beauty of that tree rather than planting a small tree and waiting 20 years for it. But this is something that's best done by a commercial service. And I get asked this a lot too, because we're getting people who have procrastinated and said, well, I'll call a company to treat my tree. Ash is tough. Do you see this one here? That was what the tree looked like in 2018. That tree was treated. 2 years later, and I couldn't find the slide here today to put it up there, that tree's completely green. Completely green. About 20%, I start to say, well, be a little cautious about it. But I do get calls from commercial companies saying, John, do you think this tree can still be treated? If it looks better than that, absolutely. And it's an otherwise healthy tree. We don't have a lot of dieback to it and that due to other things. And as a reminder, not every dying ash has emerald ash borer. This is one I got asked about. Notice it just has dieback, and with emerald ash borer, and I'll back this up, it's a thinning canopy rather than just flat out dead early on. And on this tree, I could find all the usual suspects. Right above my thumb there, that's an exit hole to one of our native ash borers, the banded ash borer. And the hole right above it, it's from our clearwing ash borer. So we've always had clearwing ash borers. We used to actually treat for them when they were the most common insect problem. If you find large holes you can put a pencil in, and you find all this dust around the base, you're looking at our native clearwing. And there's their adults, and they burrow fairly deep into the tree, and you'll find these papery pupal skins sticking out of the hole when they emerge in May. Relatively easy insect to treat. Treatment with a insecticide containing permethrin as a trunk spray for about the lower 10 feet usually manages the problem fairly well. That's usually done about the middle of May as the adults are beginning to emerge and fly. But this is an insect that attacks declining ash, right? Why? Because it's a native insect attacking its native host, and it only can succeed when it's attacking a stressed one. And then we also have the banded ash borer, and this one, and you can see it here, about the size of a penny there, fairly small. By the way, people that cut ash firewood and store it in their house, they'll start emerging from a house inside a house in about February or March. And I'll get calls from people. And then there's a red-headed ash borer. Now, these two look different as adults, but their larvae are identical and their galleries are identical. This is a gallery from either the banded ash borer or the red-headed ash borer. Like I say, they're very close related. Notice it kind of meanders around. It's not the distinct serpentine galleries that we find with the emerald ash borer, and their larvae look quite different. They kind of look like the Michelin tire guy. They're round and have these big rounded segments, where the emerald ash borer is flat and has bell-shaped segments. And then finally, I've been getting pictures of this. That's the ash bark beetle. It's very tiny. You can see it's on the tip of my knife there. And the adults are out right now. You'll find them coming out of trees. And their gallery pattern is very distinct. It is found just beneath the bark, but that long perpendicular gallery is the egg gallery. And those ones running with the grain of the wood, those are the larval galleries. These usually are only successful in either recently dead or dying ash. And a lot of people are out noticing dying ash now, and they pull the bark away and they find this thing. Oh, I found the emerald ash borer. Nope, do keep in mind, we have a number of insects, all native, that will attack declining ash. And I will also mention that that doesn't mean emerald ash borer can't be in these trees as well, because again, emerald ash borer attacks a tree, the tree starts to die, and guess what? All our native insects come to the party as well then. So with that, I'll finish. We may have a time for a question or two if there is one. But for all those folks that are going to write down their CU code for ISA, and it sounds like, as Tony mentioned, next month we may go back to you having to do this, here's the code. It is DS-25-020. And as a reminder, this is for the live presentation. In other words, you're watching it today while we're doing it live. And for all the folks that are self-reporting, very important for ISA, when you're submitting it, make sure you copy the title exactly, because that's the title we use to submit for the ISA credits. And if you don't have it the same way, they won't accept it. So the title is, What Are We Seeing This Spring? DS-25-020. And you only need that code is if you're submitting this for the International Society of Arboriculture Certified Arborist credits. So with that, Tony, I'll turn it back to you. If we've got any questions, I think we have a few minutes at least to go
Sure.
over them.
Yeah, we have a couple minutes and we want to be respectful of everybody's time, but if you do have a few extra minutes, we can get through some of these questions, I think, with just barely going over our allotted hour here. So the first question that came up was related to honey locusts. I think you hit that perfectly. Katie, if you're listening and you have any other further questions, please feel free to reach out. But our next question comes from Annie about currants. She had a lot of currants full of rust last year. This year, absolutely none of them flowered. Is that a result, do you think, of the disease or possibly the weather or environmental factor? And to follow, and I guess furthermore, is that how the plants may continue to grow into the future?
Uh, yes, it could be both. I mean, the lack of fruit is often stress related. Some plants, by the way, are alternate bearing. You get a big crop one year, small the next. But if it's something she recently noticed, big crop last year, none this year, or excuse me, none. It's either that they produced a lot of fruit the year before, so they kind of exhausted their reserves, or You combine drought and rust disease, which are both stresses, that will throw it off too. The good thing with currant bushes, they're usually self-correcting. And as long as conditions are favorable, and this year's rain's helping, hopefully she will not see that next year, or at least not as significant.
Our next question comes from Heath. Heath is curious if, oh gosh, where'd it go? If we water our hackberries, we were talking about the stress on hackberries, particularly. Do you recommend watering this time of year, or do we let nature take its course?
Excellent question. Now, if you're in an area where you're getting abundant rains, higher than normal, you probably don't need to. But just because a tree doesn't have leaves on it right now doesn't mean it doesn't need water. And thank you for mentioning that. And also, Tony, for reading this one, because if the hackberry is going to come back, you need to have moist soils so you get it out of that stress. So the mere fact it doesn't have leaves doesn't mean you should quit. And by the way, I usually use 4th of July as my gauge. If it hasn't broke bud and it's the week after the 4th of July, it probably isn't. And at that point, you might find you can break the twigs and the tree's dead. But for right now, the twigs are supple, water to get the tree to relief again. Good question. Thank you.
Heath also followed up with a question about EAB in Watertown. Do you have an estimate of how long that population may have been in Watertown?
Yes, it appears from looking at trees, I'm going to go at about 4 years.
And that's pretty typical, right? We tend to find them around 4 to 6 years after an infestation.
Correct. I think our newest was 2 years, and that was just by luck. But generally speaking, we got to have trees that are near death in order for people to really notice. So for 4 years, I would say is fairly common. Occasionally 3 and occasionally 5 as we found more in the Millbank area.
I just see a couple more questions here, Dr. Ball. Have you seen
Okay.
more needle cast this year? Carter wants to know.
Haven't seen it yet. I expect to see it. Yeah, thank you for mentioning that because with these wet conditions, I expect to see a lot of untreated spruce trees become infected. And that infection usually starts to present later on the summer with those needles turning purple this fall. So you're right. That's another problem we yet to see, but the treatments should have been done about a month ago.
And our final question then comes from Kelly. Is there a time of the year to avoid pruning paper birch?
Yes, June. There's a excellent paper, scientific paper written in 1990 by me. But yeah, it was a study that we did that found that the bronze birch borer is attracted to fresh pruning wounds. And so the adults are flying in June. So that is the month to avoid pruning. And by the way, you would avoid pruning ash if you're in a county where emerald ash borer is found, because you're going to attract them even more. So thank you for that one. And the other one to mention too for everyone, we don't prune elms, the American elms, between April and October because that will attract the beetles that are carrying Dutch elm disease. And for those in the very eastern end of our state, we don't prune oaks in May and June because that will attract the little picnic beetle that carries oak wilt. We do not see oak wilt very often in South Dakota, but occasionally it does appear in Minnehaha County. It is a major problem over in Minnesota. They have billboards, don't prune oaks in May and June. So you're right. So we can increase insect problems by pruning at the wrong time.
Well, that wraps up all the questions in the chat. Dr. Ball, thank you so much for your time today. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. One last call for any SAF credentials. If you are a Society of American Forester certified forester, please put your credentials in there and make sure to join us next month, July, for our 30th episode of the Forest Health Workshop. Dr. Ball, I can't believe it. We've done 29 episodes now. So
We had to see if somebody's watched all of them and give them a prize.
seriously, there's a couple names on here I'm pretty sure I've seen every time. So we're thrilled to have everybody join us. We're looking forward to giving you more information in the future. And we hope you enjoy the rest of your week.
I hope you do too, and I'll bet we'll talk to you about another emerald ash borer find. We'll put that as my prediction for July. So thanks, everybody.